Legwork of looking at the terms now of ger and proselytos. Next thing I want to come to in ITP is now we might ask ourselves the question, now that we're introduced to the terms for proselytism, just how successful were the Jewish people in gaining proselytoi, proselytes? That's what I want to address tonight. And then I think it will be an appropriate thing also to conclude on, since we won't be back to ITP and proselytism for about a month. Just how successful were the Jewish people, the diaspora Jewish people as well as the Palestinian Jewish people, in gaining their proselytoi? Well, our first guess would probably be not very. The Jewish people couldn't have been that successful in winning the proselytoi to the religion of Moses because of several things. In the first place, because of this principle of Jewish exclusiveness that we have seen before. About 6 messages ago, we looked at high tensions in the diaspora. Now, if you're an exclusive people, you tend to keep to yourself. You don't really want additional members, and certainly not the filthy members of the Gentile race out there. You don't really want additional members added to your group. You prefer just to keep your group rather narrow, another term for exclusive. So we would guess, if we're asking how successful were they in gaining converts to their religion, the proselytoi, then we would probably say our first inclination anyway would be not very. They probably were not very successful because they were such exclusive people. But we do need to remember on this subject of the sectarian nature of the Jewish faith that this was primarily true of Old Testament Israel. We have to make quite a distinction between Old Testament Israel and New Testament, and we include with New Testament the period between the Testaments. In other words, if we're going to make a division, and we've got the Old Testament, and we have the period between the Testaments, and we have the New Testament, we're going to join this with either the Old or the New. It would probably look more like this, as far as the Jewish people are concerned in the change. Old Testament Jewry is one thing. ITP, NT Jewry is something else, rather than putting the mark over here. So we say the big change that we see is over in the New Testament. I don't think that's true at all. I think everything that we've been looking at thus far proves that to be false. And I think that's one reason we're actually looking at the subject of the period between the Testaments is what happens, why do we have such a change when we come to the New Testament? I guess we could assume that the change starts with the New Testament times, but of course it doesn't. It would be best to join the ITP era with that of the New Testament. So remember, as far as exclusiveness is concerned, that this primarily was true of Israel in the Old Testament. Once she was scattered out of her land and began to come into contact with so many of the Gentiles in the world, and it seems as though Israel's outlook changed. On the one hand, she would think that Old Testament prophecy is being fulfilled. Isaiah had prophesied she would be a light unto the Gentiles, a light unto the nations, the Goyim, the Hebrew says, the nations or the Gentiles, the peoples out there. So on one hand, she would probably think, well, now we're seeing the fulfillment of prophecy. And if we're going to be a light to the Gentiles, we have to somehow relate to them. Therefore, we'll drop our guard of Jewish exclusiveness. And on the other hand, it could be argued, as the critical world really does, critical biblical scholarship, that Israel was in such a naive, infantile stage in the Old Testament because she was so secluded by herself, that it's just a sociological development of humanity, that once she is scattered and finds herself outside of the confines of Palestine, and it seems like in some way there's going to be a diluting of the interpretation of the Mosaic Law. How can all those things be fulfilled? So much of that meant for the, quote, church in the wilderness, unquote, Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7, when now they're not in the wilderness, neither are they in Palestine, but they're scattered out among the Goyim, among the Gentile nations. And so you tend to lose your exclusiveness. And of course, that's the same argument that would be used against the church if it becomes too exclusive. These sociologists would. That in other words, they have big problems with the subject of a group becoming too inbred. You just produce after your own kind, and you only listen to your own type leaders, and so forth. I remember whenever I first went down to Gordon Conwell to talk with Director of Admissions David Otis there, and we were talking about different seminaries and what my opinions were of different ones, and I said that, as far as doctrinal beliefs and adherence to what I feel the Scriptures teach, I would prefer a place like Grace or Dallas. And I'll never forget his comment. He said, "Oh, you wouldn't want to go to those places, they're inbred." And what he meant was that all the professors there have doctor's degrees from Grace or Dallas. You get a doctor's degree, and then you get to teach at Grace. You get a master's, then you get to become a teaching assistant at Grace. They don't want to just hire everyone out there. In other words, they want to control the way that you think so they can control what you say when you become a teacher, so they can control all the students so that we have uniformity there. And of course, his desire was for plurality or pluralism, David Otis. And so we've got many professors from many different walks of life here. And he wouldn't have to tell you that for you to find out. Because you'd go from one class to another and find everyone contradicting themselves. And at least if you're going to be wrong, then be inbred wrong and stay the same. Or be right, be inbred right. But I think the tendency of natural man is to think that the truth is so impossible of ever really knowing or comprehending that we have a better chance of coming close to it if we adopt the doctrine of pluralism and hire as many people from as many different backgrounds, and hopefully one of them will be from the right background. So they wouldn't like the exclusive, inbred type nature of a place like Dallas Seminary, where obviously Dallas feels it has the truth. And so why hire professors outside your seminary when you can educate them and turn them loose right there on your own grounds? If you feel like you got the truth, that makes all the sense in the world to me. So, and what I'm saying concerning Jewish exclusiveness is that it changes. They lose that sectarian nature in the period between the Testaments. Now, I think that they will revert again to Jewish exclusiveness after the 1st century A.D., and we shall see that later. And the cause for that will be the explosive expanse of early Christianity. That now Christianity has gone out and attacked the Goyim and has been so successful, the Jewish faith there's no way that she can measure up to the success that early Christianity experiences. And so she reverts back to her Old Testament ways of sectarianism and exclusiveness. You see, I'm not passing judgment on whether it's right to be exclusive or not. Exclusive has exclusive meanings to it. It already has kind of, smug meanings of self-righteousness to it. So we'd have to get into the whole business of determining exactly what we mean, a definition of the term here. But it would make sense. This was true of the Old Testament. God taught the Jewish people to be exclusive. He said, "I have loved you and you only, and you're the apple of my eye, and don't mix with the heathen pagan people out there." So I think it would be a good principle to assume that if we have the truth, there's nothing wrong with being exclusive. Because if you have the truth and you're not exclusive, you're going to lose the truth by mixing with other people.
Amen.
And I think Paul teaches that in 2 Corinthians 6 by saying, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. And then a second reason, I said there may be two reasons why we would guess off the bat that the Jews were not very successful in gaining the proselytoi. One was because they were so exclusive, they really wouldn't want to gain or win any proselytoi. And the second reason, which is produced by the first, would be the subject of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was produced by Jewish exclusiveness. As soon as we humans find a group that's exclusive, for some reason we don't like them because it appears as though they don't like us. And so we join a group and get on the bandwagon of criticizing them. Now, we covered this 6 messages ago in one entitled High Tensions in the Diaspora, where we looked at Jewish exclusiveness, what had been taught in the Old Testament, and we looked what it produced, anti-Semitism. The Jews were exclusive. They had certain peculiar laws, such as a prohibition of work on the Sabbath, and that worked its way around as they were scattered among the Goyim out there. That worked its way around to having them exempted from military service, because you can't just take Sunday off or Saturday off. You can't just take the Sabbath off if you're in war or something. So they were exempt from military service, and the rest of the Gentiles around them tend to look down on them because it appeared as though their Roman leaders were showing favoritism toward the Jewish people. And so you'd band together and put a hate label on the Jewish people, and it's become known as anti-Semitism today. Now, we saw this earlier in Scripture. 3 places in Acts. In Acts 16, verses 19 through 24. Now, we've read these, so I don't think we'll read them again, but there Paul and Silas are at Philippi, and what they've done is they've delivered that girl in around verse 16, I suppose. They've delivered that girl from an evil spirit. And, of course, her masters lose the prospect of financial gain. They were using her more or less as a slave whenever Paul cast the spirit out. But what charge do they bring? Well, these are Jews, and they bring customs that are not lawful for those of us who are Romans to follow. Paul happened to be a Roman as well, a Roman citizen. And what was the first comment? These are Jews. You see latent anti-Semitism right there. It's under the surface, and all it takes is a spark to bring it forth. And then they are beaten illegally. You can't beat a Roman without a trial. Paul had Roman citizenship. He was beaten illegally. And then in Acts 18 in verse 2, during the days of Claudius Caesar, all of the Jews were expelled from Rome. One of those that was expelled was Aquila and his wife Priscilla. And that's why they meet Paul over in Corinth, which would be the geographical context of Acts 18 and verse 2. And then in the same chapter in verse 17, Acts 18:17, you have a third case in the book of Acts of latent anti-Semitism that's ignited by a very small spark. There you have the case of Gallio, and the Jews are wanting to bring a case against Paul, and he said, well, since it concerns your religion and your laws, and I don't want to discuss this matter, then the Gentiles, as soon as they saw that they had the local leader Gallio on their side, then the Gentiles took the new leader of the local Jewish synagogue and beat him before the judgment seat publicly, and said that Gallio cared for none of those things. They were waiting for an opportunity to mistreat the Jewish people, and they found it in Acts 18:17. And then something else that I said in that message, 6 messages ago, High Tensions in the Diaspora, was that certain of the early writers, such as Cicero and Tacitus and Juvenal and so forth, were very anti-Semitic in their views. And I said on that tape that I would save the specific quotations and references for the future. So that's what I want to give you now. We were just passing through that then. I want to give you these specific references right now. So we see it in the book of Acts 3 times, twice in chapter 18 and once in chapter 16. Now for some of the extra biblical references. First of all, Cicero. Most of these are well-known names, writing around this period of time. Cicero said that the Jewish people were involved in, quote, barbaric superstition. This business of temples and sacrifice and one God and Levitical laws, that the Jewish people were involved in, quote, barbaric superstition. A second biblical or extra-biblical source would be Tacitus, T-A-C-I-T-U-S. Tacitus. His complaint was that the Jewish people, in making proselytes, made them antisocial people. which kind of goes back to that Jewish exclusiveness bit. Made them antisocial people who despised the pagan gods, lost all former patriotism for the Roman state, and grew cold even toward family members and former friends. Well, you see, all of those things would have to be qualifications you would meet, or requirements you would meet, in order to be a true convert to the Jewish faith. Or let's say it another way, not necessarily qualifications, but that would be the fruit of your conversion. You'd manifest these three things as the fruit of your conversion if you were a true proselyte, and people could put the name tag of antisocialism on that. You're an antisocial person, because now you despise the pagan gods that the rest of us accept, so you're coming across with a holier-than-thou attitude. Earlier, the pagan gods were good enough for you. Why aren't they good enough for you now? They lost all their former patriotism for the Roman state and government, and they grew cold even toward former friends and family members. This is in Tacitus History 5:4 and following, which would look like this. Tacitus History 5:4 and following. So he didn't like, you see, from a reference like that, on one hand, we would think that probably the Jewish people were not very successful in proselytism, because look at the hatred that's stirred up here. And how would you like to be a proselyte, a Gentile, who maybe looked up to Tacitus before, you converted to the Jewish faith, and all these things are said about you and thought about you? It'd be a life filled with tension then. You now would enter into, not vicariously, but personally, into the relationship of the Jewish people who suffered high tensions because of their desire to be faithful to the Mosaic revealed religion, but their desire not to stand out as an awkward wart in contemporary society. Then a third extra-biblical reference would be Juvenal, Juvenal. His complaint was that the community, or the communities of the Jewish people, including their new proselytes, were too closely knit. In other words, antisocial behavior again. Were too closely knit. And that they were partial toward fellow believers. Well, that's true, but that's really no complaint, because it looks as though Juvenal would be partial toward anyone who's not partial toward the Jewish people. So he shows partiality himself. As soon as you point out, well, you're being partial to someone, well, you're partial to another opinion, or you wouldn't think that they're partial to someone. I mean, in other words, Juvenal will have his crowd that he would run in, and the Jewish people would have theirs that they would run in, and the proselytes would have theirs that they run in. So it's really no complaint at all, because as soon as we say that, that's true of ourselves as well. Now, if he wants to say they were unfairly partial, that would be another matter. But he doesn't. He just says that they're partial. In other words, it's still the theme of them being antisocial. And in his work, let's see, Satires 1496 through 106. His work, Satires, I believe it's 1496 through 106, he describes his whole story of how an entire Gentile family would be won to the Jewish faith. And it's rather humorous. But he gives a series of steps, and I won't go into all of that, but he's describing how an entire family would be won. And this is interesting. This is a good historical reference for us in knowing, well, how did they convert? He didn't describe just a family all of a sudden waking up one morning, a Gentile family, and saying, we think we'll convert to Judaism. He said it was a gradual process. And he said, first of all, something like this would happen. The father would begin saying that it's good to take one day a week off work. But the Jewish people had a point here in their Sabbath day of rest. Sabbath in Hebrew simply means rest. So the father would begin the process in the family by adhering to the Sabbath law. And then the mother would find a law that would fit her, and she would begin to subscribe to that. And then the eldest son would take the next step in the family. He would find a law that would fit his case, and he would imitate that. And then before you know it, each family member had found a particular law in Judaism that they liked, that fit them. And they had practiced it, and then they would share the law that they were enjoying with other family members, who in turn would share the law they are enjoying with that family member. And before you know it, after a period of time, it was gradual, it was a process, the whole family would be converted to Judaism. Now, remember, it's in this word right here. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. This is called satires here. We have to take it with a grain of salt. There probably is some truth in it, the truth being that it was a gradual process. But the Jewish people really did not want, you couldn't be a full proselyte if all you saw were, economic or social, and you certainly couldn't find any social, maybe economic advantages to adopting Judaism. Well, then you're not a true convert. You have to convert from your heart. It has to be religion of the heart, as they say, before you'd be allowed to convert and become a full proselyte of righteousness. So take that with a grain of salt. It's a humorous account, but it's probably satirical, and that's why it's in satires. But the germ of truth would be it was a gradual process. So Juvenal doesn't like these people very much, doesn't like the Jewish people. He doesn't like what they're trying to do with his Gentile comrades. And then a fourth extra-biblical source would be Josephus. Now we're to a Jewish writer. Those were three Gentile writers. Josephus, in his work against Appian, contra Appian, against Appian. Appian was an Egyptian who spread the rumor that the Jewish people were so base and so abominable that they yearly sacrificed a Greek on their altar in Jerusalem and ate his entrails, showing their contempt for the pagan gods. Now that's the rumor that Appian spread throughout Egypt. And so Josephus, in one entire book of his entitled Contra Appian, against Appian, he argues, contrary, that the religion of the Jewish people was the most ancient and civilized of all. He argued that anything good that could be found in paganism, in the Greek or the Roman form of worship, anything good that could be found in paganism actually owed its derivation to the high morals and pure ethics established centuries ago in Judaism, or more specifically in Mosaicism. Now, Philo, a comrade of his who comes somewhat later than Josephus, is going to do pretty much the same thing. Going to argue for the purity and the antiquity of the Jewish faith. So we have 2 points in trying to answer this question: how successful were they? We've got, first of all, the Jewish exclusiveness, and then secondly, we have this anti-Semitism. How could they have been successful with their exclusiveness and with this anti-Semitism? Well, remember, exclusiveness is really true only of Old Testament Israel, and not Israel between the Testaments. That marks that argument out. And this business of anti-Semitism, how could you be successful when people were so opposed to you, could also be marked out as an argument and really turned around as an argument for the reverse side, because you probably would not have such a negative attitude toward you and your group, which is manifested in this business of anti-Semitism, unless you were enjoying a great measure of success. If you're not successful out there at all, people are probably going to leave you alone. So I think both of these arguments really are not valid in answering the question, how successful were they, with the answer, not very, in proselytism, not very successful. I think that the answer would be just the reverse. They were very successful in proselytism. But we have to address the opposite opinion and look at its arguments before we can go on. No, I think that such a negative attitude as seen in Cicero and Tacitus, Juvenal, and Appian toward the Jewish people would not have been possible unless they were enjoying a very large measure of proselyte success. The Gentiles don't like seeing so many people won over to the Jewish faith. Now, it's impossible to give figures, just how successful were the Jewish people. But the latter part of the period between the Testaments was the scene for extensive Jewish missionary activity, which was both widespread in extent and successful in numbers. This is primarily true of the second half. That would be the 1st and 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD, period of 300 years. The latter half of the period between the Testaments was the scene for extensive Jewish missionary activity, which was both widespread in extent, it was Palestinian as well as diaspora, and successful in numbers. Widespread, I mean all over the Roman Empire, including Palestine. Successful in numbers. We can't give precise figures. We couldn't even guess at the number, but we feel successful nonetheless. Well, these two arguments are not true. They really don't weigh very heavily in answering this question: how successful were the Jews in gaining the proselytoi? Then we mark them out, but we have to have evidence now of their success. We can't just rule, by the reverse of this, so the fact that these two seem to be non-effective. We'd be ruling from silence then, and answering in the affirmative, they were very successful. So let's start with some 1, 2, 3, 4s, and so forth points that tend to point toward Jewish success in both, and we're lumping it together tonight, in both Palestinian and diaspora proselytizing. With me so far? This is the second half of our study tonight then. For number 1, let's start with the post-exilic biblical record. The post-exilic biblical record, by that I mean Ezra chapters 9 and 10, Nehemiah chapter 13. Ezra chapters 9 and 10, Nehemiah chapter 13. Now, we really don't consider this ITP, period between the Testaments. It's the end of the Old Testament era. These chapters, you'll find the theme of the problem of intermarriage. Remember that at the end of Ezra and Nehemiah? The problem of intermarriage between the Jews and the heathens. Now, the marriages may have been okay in many cases if the spouse would convert to Judaism. And this may have actually been the cause for some of these marriages. But even if we allow that concession, the marriages still do not appear in a very favorable light. Let's just look at a couple of places here. Ezra 9:2. Ezra 9:2. For they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed. Now that's an interesting reference there. The holy seed. It's the only place you'll find it here in Ezra. So that the holy seed, it's like Holy Land. We always call Palestine the Holy Land, that I took a trip to the Holy Land. That's only found one time in the Bible. Zechariah chapter 2 is the only place that's found, the Holy Land. So that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers hath been chief in this trespass. They set the precedent for the other people to follow. But then take a look at verses 11 and 12, this chapter. which thou hast commanded by thy servants the prophets, saying, the land into which ye go to possess it is an unclean land, with the filthiness of the people of the lands, with their abominations, which have filled it from one end to another with their uncleanness. Now therefore give not your daughters unto their sons, neither take their daughters unto your sons, nor seek their peace or their wealth forever. See, they're certainly exclusive at this time, or God means for them to be. But notice they're slowly breaking away from that. And that's to their own harm. That ye may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children, so you won't have a half-bred seed to your children forever. In other words, even if the marriages end up okay with the spouse converting, and some people could argue that's why we have these intermarriages. I really don't think that's the case, but say the spouse is very interested, you should get them converted before you marry them anyway. That would be the Jewish law. You couldn't marry a pagan, a heathen. You can marry one who's a proselyte, but you have to wait until they become a proselyte before you marry them. Paul says the same thing in 2 Corinthians 6. You can marry a lost person anytime you want to, as soon as they get converted. Once they get converted, then you as a Christian can marry them. You can marry any lost person you want to once they're converted. That was true for the Jewish people. They could marry, a Moabite, like Ruth. Ruth was married to Boaz, remember. But Boaz can't marry Ruth until Ruth becomes a convert. She has to become a proselyte. And she does with her great confession there around verses 15 and 16 of Ruth chapter 1. And so he marries her in chapter 4. He tricks old such a one, as the King James says. He sat there by the gate, and old such a one came by. That was the relative nearer than him. He said, I hear that Naomi has a field and everything to buy, and I just want to let you know in case you want it. And old such a one says, I'll take it. And Boaz says, and by the way, I forgot to say that when you take it, you have to marry the Moabitess Ruth. I don't think I'll take it. Because he knew that he has to mar his seed, mar his inheritance, as we read there in the KJV, and that the eldest son produced in this marriage is going to receive some of his inheritance, so that, the name all the way back through the former husband of Ruth, which was the son of Naomi and Elimelech, so that his seed and his name, so that Elimelech's name, and Naomi as well, would not die out in Israel. So we see marriages, we see the intermarriage between the pagans and the Jews, but the pagans become Jews, small j, before they are allowed to marry. So we see a very negative framework and a very negative context for intermarriage here. And the same is true in Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 1 to 3. Just the next book over there. Nehemiah 13, 1 to 3. On that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people, and there was found written that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever. Now that's back in Deuteronomy 23. The Ammonite and the Moabite would be up around verse 2 or 3 or 4, and then you have the Edomite and the Egyptian down around verse 7, 8, or 9 in that chapter, Deuteronomy 23. Because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. And now it came to pass, when they heard the law, that they separated from Israel all the rabble, the mixed multitude of Exodus chapter 12. And then you read the conclusion in verses 23 through 31. Those days also I saw Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, that would be Philistia, so Philistines, Ammonites, and Moabites. Nehemiah 13:23. Philistines, Ammonites, and Moabites. And their children spake half in the speech of the Philistines, and then of course half in the speech of the Jewish people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, so forth. This is a famous verse in Nehemiah, the beginning and end of 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. What a translation. I don't know what an outlandish woman is. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women. Maybe it's literally out of the land type of women, pagans in other words. but I doubt that's really what they meant. Outlandish women cause him to sin. And of course, he's even found one of the sons of the priests in verse 28 involved in this, and we had already seen that in Ezra 9 and verse 2, the end of that verse. Well, anyway, this isn't a big concern because it's pre-diaspora. They're back in their homeland here. We're not talking about the diaspora. They're back in Palestine, and this isn't even into the intertestamental period. But we start there because that is where we begin seeing a breakaway from Jewish exclusiveness, which will lead toward proselytism. Now, all down through Israel's history, she had probably won converts, as we've seen with people like Ruth and Rahab, a few here and a few there. But it's not until the period between the Testaments that the activity really steps up a beat, both at home and abroad. So let's keep looking at some evidence by moving specifically into ITP, the intertestamental period. Number 2, I would give you as a reference 2 Maccabees 9:17. 2 Maccabees 9:17. Now let me give you a little history before I read this. In the Apocrypha, the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, we have 3 accounts, but I'll just say we have 2 accounts of the horrible, treacherous death of Antiochus Epiphanes. One is in 1st Maccabees chapter 6, verses 8 through 16, which is rather charitable. He does die somewhat loathsomely, but not as grotesquely as he does in 2nd Maccabees chapter 9, verses 4 through 29. And 2nd Maccabees 1, 13 through 17 also gives another account of his death. Now the 2 accounts can't be reconciled. 1st Maccabees 6, 2nd Maccabees 9. They can't be reconciled. There are too many discrepancies. And since 2nd Maccabees is the more outlandish of the 2, the more fantastic of the 2, it's probably the one that's spurious. Let me just remind you of that account by reading a few verses here, and then I'll get to the pertinent one, which is 17. Antiochus goes overseas. He sent an army back into Judea, and of course whenever he's overseas he tries to rob a temple in Persepolis, and the priests catch him in chapter 1 of 2nd Maccabees, so they whack off his arms and then cut off his elbows and then the shoulder joints and whack off his head and all of this. And that's different than the accounts you have in 1st Maccabees, which is different than the accounts you have in 2nd Maccabees 9. As soon as he heard the words that the army he had sent into Palestine was making a retreat back up to Syria, he was seized with incurable pain, I'm in verse 5, in his bowels, and with sharp internal torments, a punishment entirely fitting for one who had inflicted many unheard-of torments on the bowels of others. After he had given orders to speed up the journey, it happened that he fell out of his chariot as it hurtled along, and so violent was his fall that every joint in his body was dislocated. A worm swarmed even from the eyes of this godless man. And while he was still alive and in agony, his flesh rotted off. The whole army was disgusted by the stench of his decay. Of course, the historian here in 2nd Maccabees, you can tell he's relishing the account here. And he's probably embellishing it because he relishes the account so much. Well, you know what Antiochus does? He kind of makes a vow on his deathbed that he had made a mistake, that all of these things were coming upon him because he had raided the Jewish temple, he had killed so many Jewish people, and what he desires to do at the end of his life is convert to Judaism. And so we have here in verse 17, part of his speech, in addition to all this, he would even turn Jew and visit every inhabited place to proclaim God's might. Well, there's our earliest and first ITP reference to the subject of proselytism, that the arch enemy of the Jews between the Testaments, Antiochus Epiphanes, was said to have desired to convert. But of course the account is rather fantastic. Then a third reference, I'll sum several things up here. both during the time of John Hyrcanus, that would be 135 to 104 BC, and during the time of Aristobulus I, which would be 104 to 102, I believe. 102. Aristobulus I. During both of, and these were Jewish leaders that ruled over the people during this period of somewhat independence. Both during the time of John Hyrcanus, 135 to 104 BC, and Aristobulus I, 104 to 102 BC, the Jewish people practiced forced circumcision on people bordering Israel. So here on number 3, we're talking about forced circumcision. We discussed this on ITP tape number 40. That's where you'll find that. Particularly the Idumeans. We're talking about people who bordered Israel, that they practiced forced circumcision. In other words, that's forced proselytism. If you become circumcised, you become a proselyte. Of course, that's really not the way to go about doing it, forcing someone. It's like the medieval church, forcing people at the point of the sword to a belief in Christ. Josephus gives us the account in Antiquities 13:9:1. See, I told you we'd have lots of statistics and references from here on out in proselytism. We have to run all these references. You don't find information. We don't have ITP. We have Malachi and then we have Matthew. We don't have ITP. That's why we're studying it. We have to fill in the blanks here in order to bridge that gap. But Josephus in Antiquities 13:9:1. Here are our references. Remember, back in the Old Testament era, we don't have references to Jewish proselytism. They were exclusive people. There were proselytes, a few here and a few there. They were few and far between, people like Rahab and Ruth. Now we're increasingly finding references, and we're going to find them more and more and more as we go along, and then we're going to find them less and less and less, and they're going to stop. I mean, it's just going to be like this. It's low and it goes up, ITP, and it stays up for a while. New Testament period, it's up. This is, let's say, New Testament period right there, and it's going to go back down again. That's the pattern, to give you a graph here, just a little mountain. That's the pattern of proselytism for the Jewish people. So in other words, what I'm saying is, since the New Testament era enters right here, and this is just a little bit prior to it, then the theme of proselytism is a very important theme in Judaism during the time of Jesus and the apostles. It wasn't a long time before that, let's say 300-400 years. It won't be 200 years after that. It's a theme that's important right here. That's why we have to study it right during this period. Now you can look in your notes, ITP 40, and you'll find some more of those historical references and everything about John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus I. But let me just read you this paragraph from Josephus, Antiquities 13:9:1. Then you'll also find a reference, I won't read this one, in 13:11:3. Also find a reference in 13:11:3. But this is the clearest one, 13:9:1. During the time of Hyrcanus, which is, as you see, toward the end of the 2nd century BC, almost to the, during the last quarter of the 2nd century BC. But when Hyrcanus heard of the death of Antiochus, he presently made an expedition against the cities of Syria, hoping to find them destitute of fighting men and of such as were able to defend them. You know earlier from ITP how the balance of power has shifted between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Starts off with the Ptolemies, it ends up with the Seleucids under Antiochus Epiphanes. In 165, they break that. 165 BC, the Jewish people break the yoke of the Syrians or the Seleucids over them and experience a period of about 100 years of somewhat independence until Pompey invades Syria in 64 and Palestine in 63 BC. So almost exactly 100 years. You've got a period of Hebrew independence. And so now what the Jewish people are doing, they're going on the offensive. They've been used as the rope in a tug of war between the people in Egypt, the Ptolemies, and the people in Syria, the Seleucids. And now they're going to go on the offensive and do some tugging on someone else's hide. So Hyrcanus is now up in Syria attacking. However, it was not until the 6th month that he took Medeba, and that not without the greatest distress of his army. After this, he took Samiga and the neighboring places, and besides these, Shechem and Gerizim, the nation of the Kuthians, who dwelt at the temple, which resembled that temple, which was at Jerusalem, and which Alexander, this is the Samaritan temple in Gerizim, which Alexander permitted Sanballat, the general of his army, to build for the sake of Manasseh, who was son-in-law to Jaddua, the high priest, as we have formerly related, which temple was now deserted 200 years after it was built, because Hyrcanus destroyed the thing. Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea. Now we're to this right here. This is the important place, Idumea. Edom, the Edomites, that's the Old Testament name, Edom and Edomites. ITP name is Idumea and the Idumeans. And subdued all the Idumeans and permitted them to stay in that country. And then boy, are we running out of room up here. If we have Palestine here, and here's Jerusalem, remember Idumea is kind of down here at the bottom. Permitted them to stay in that country if they would circumcise them, make use of the law, and make use of the laws of the Jews. And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers that they submitted to the use of circumcision and the rest of the Jewish ways of living. At which time, therefore, this befell them, that they were hereafter no other than Jews. Now here's the forced proselytism of an entire nation of people, tribal type people, but an entire group of people, the Idumeans. Israel's on the advance for proselytism. This business of Jewish exclusiveness and anti-Semitism, we'd say they weren't very successful. I think the evidence is going to point just to the opposite side. They're successful in forcing proselytism and circumcision on a whole group of people here, the Idumeans. Now the next leader, who was Alexander Jannaeus from 102 to 76 BC. (102 to 76), Alexander Jannaeus, Jannaeus. Alexander Jannaeus, 102 to 76 BC, destroyed the city of Pella, P-E-L-L-A, which, if we give ourselves the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea, Pella's over here, on that side. What in the Old Testament was Moab, and Edom in the Old Testament was right down below that. Alexander Jannaeus destroys Pella during his reign because they refused to embrace the religion of Judaism. In other words, what we see during this period, if I try to get rid of some of this scribble up here, well, here, this looks like a good boundary. Give ourselves Jerusalem here. In other words, all of these surrounding countries on this side and on this side and on this side, and you've only got the fish on the western side, all the surrounding countries, the Jewish people are attempting to force into Judaism. They're attempting to force them by forced proselytism, forced circumcision. Now, of course, we're talking about, let's say, 100 years prior to Christ, and then some and minus some, but approximately 100 years prior to the time of Christ. Whenever he comes on the scene, so we're talking about during his lifetime and the 1st century A.D., and the Jewish attitude turned against this business of forced proselytism. Both Josephus and the rabbis. Josephus was not a rabbi, a Jewish historian, but both Josephus and the rabbis were very much opposed to this form of proselytizing activity. So this business of forcing them was something temporary in Judaism. Now, I know I'm giving you a lot of facts. This board will prove it up here. Now, I'd like to see who could put a number 1, 2, 3, 4 in order on everything that's up there. That would be a miracle. You could look at your notes, I guess. Give myself some room to write. It's something temporary. As we go along, seeing the sentiments of Josephus and the rabbis, they were very much opposed to this form of proselytism, and rightly so. You can't force people into faith like that. I guess you can. You can force them into your religion and your faith, but they're not necessarily going to believe that in their heart. So that was number 3. Number 4. See, we're trying to add up the evidence here that they were very successful in extent and in numbers in their proselytizing endeavors. Number 4, King Herod the Great. What nationality was Herod? An Idumean. He was an Edomite. Old Testament name, an Idumean, the New Testament name. Which would mean, and of course we know he becomes what? King of the Jews. He's called King of the Jews in Matthew chapter 2. Well, that would mean that he is a descendant from one of those forced circumcised Idumeans earlier. He has to be a descendant of one of those. And King Herod the Great, there were other Herods, that's why he's known as the Great, certainly would be the best known proselyte in Israel's history. That is Israel during this time. And maybe of all time. Maybe he's greater than Ruth as far as names are concerned. King Herod the Great. One of the greatest, best-known proselytes in Israel's history. Now, we discussed him and his proselytism on ITP number 46. Now, of course, one problem that Herod ran into was the fact that in becoming king of the Jewish people, he has interrupted the Hasmonean dynasty now. The Maccabean, or it also became known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Mattathias was the old priest of Modin, who first of all revolts against the emissaries of Antiochus Epiphanes, and that revolt is really carried out under his son Judas Maccabeus. And then all of these people, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus and Alexander Jannaeus and so forth, are supposed to be, and most of them are, in the Hasmonean dynasty. They have descended from the Maccabeans. Well, of course, Herod, being an Edomite, couldn't have descended from them. So in order to be accepted among the Jewish people, he's got to remedy this matter. Well, you can't correct your genes or your blood or your descent, but you can marry a Jew. And if you marry a Jew, somehow now you're into the Jewish bloodline. At least your children will have Jewish blood in them. So he has to marry a Jew in order to satisfy the Jews. Now there is a story, and I may not have mentioned this on ITP 46, so I think I'll just throw it in here. There is a story of him that says he really descended from the first Jews who returned to Babylon after the exile. In other words, he has pure Jewish lineage. But from all appearances, that story is a fairy tale that was composed under the tutelage of King Herod the Great by his court historian, Nicholas of Damascus, to make him look better, more acceptable in the eyes of the Jewish people. So I don't know if I mentioned that story. I just will throw it in there now. That's a story made up by his court historian, Nicholas of Damascus, written by him, putting the records of, the Jewish kings so that it would make him look better when people down in history looked back on him. Then, of course, he's got some descendants, some of which are going to marry Jewish people, again, if they want to stand in good favor with the Jewish people. You may remember the story of Agrippa, King Herod Agrippa the First. He's the Herod of Acts 12. King Herod Agrippa the First. I told you this story on one of those earlier tapes. Who, when reading at the Feast of Tabernacles, Deuteronomy 17, gives the laws for the kingship. Deuteronomy 17, one of those laws being that he has to be a Jew, native-born, home-born, can't be Gerim, can't be a Ger. That Herod Agrippa began to weep over his Idumean ancestry. And whenever all the people heard that, they cried out to him, and I quote, and this is from Josephus' writings, and we gave it to you earlier, "O be not dismayed, King Agrippa, for you are indeed our brother." Now the Jews never would have said that in the Old Testament economy. An Idumean, an Edomite, but you see they have lost their theological distinctives. And now they're embracing this pagan man, Agrippa the First, the Herod of Acts 12, who's a persecutor of the early church, remember, who is smitten by the angel of God and who's eaten of worms, according to the historian Luke in Acts 12, the end of that, and according to Josephus as well. They say to him, "Be not dismayed, you are indeed our brother." In other words, the reason I'm giving you this is to show you the Jewish people are opening up more and more, embracing other people around them. And it certainly speaks of proselytism. Okay, number 5. These others will be rather short, I think. We've got to go through 9, though. Number 5. Around the time of Christ, many of the rabbis wrote in favor of proselytism. Probably a large number of them wrote in favor, the rabbis wrote in favor of proselytism. 1st century A.D. It is even reported that the great rabbinical teacher Hillel, Hillel, that the great Jewish leader Hillel said that the Jews' duty was, quote, loving mankind and bringing them nigh to the law. Loving mankind and bringing them nigh to the law. He said that was the duty of the Jewish people. Now we've seen this business earlier in Christian ethics. What was the doctrine of love, and what did they think about love? That they felt that, and we see this in Luke 10, whenever Jesus, whenever they ask him what's the great commandment, he said, love God and love your neighbor. But then there is occasion when a lawyer asks him, and Jesus puts the responsibility back on him and says, well, what says the law? This is Luke 10, which leads into the parable of the certain Samaritan. And the scribe, the lawyer, answered correctly the same answer Jesus gave in other portions of the Gospels: love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So they understood something about love. They didn't understand all about it, but they knew that was somehow the sum of the Old Testament was love for God and love for your neighbor. And by that they would mean that if you fulfill that, you will not violate other laws. And Paul teaches that in Romans 13, that love is the fulfilling of the law. It's not that love is in the place of the law. It fulfills the law. If you love, you won't break the commandments. First 4 are commandments concerning God, of the 10 commandments. And the last 6 are commandments concerning your relationship to other people. So if you love God, you won't break the first 4. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you won't break the last 6. You wouldn't kill him. You wouldn't lie to him. You wouldn't commit adultery with his wife. You wouldn't covet his field. If you loved him, you wouldn't break all of that. But this is the important part for us tonight. Bring them nigh to the law. Proselytism. Outstanding. You wouldn't find that in Old Testament Judaism. Outstanding here that Hillel is writing that. And number 6. King Isaias Izates of Adiabene. We've looked at in biblical lit before. Adibene. King Izates of Adiabene. This may have been the greatest Jewish achievement in the diaspora, the winning of this king, Izates, his mother, Helena, his brother, Monobazus, in the midst of the 1st century A.D. You'll find a little of that history of all places on lit tapes 112 and 113. Lit tapes 112 and 113. Now this is an important incident. We'll look at the particulars of this case more at a later time, but I mean here in proselytism. Before we're through, we'll come back to Izates. His conversion of his mother, Helena, the conversion of his brother, Monobazus. Monobazus. Then number 7, Philo. More references here. Like Josephus, his writings pointed to Judaism as the foundation for all beauty and truth found in Greek thought. He was writing to a cultured Greek audience. And so perhaps many converts in his home city of Alexandria were just that, proselytes, converts to Judaism, because he exhorts them to courage and to steadfastness. Let me quickly try to get these last two on tape here. Number 8, Josephus wrote, and I quote, "Many have agreed to adopt our laws, of whom some have remained faithful, while others, lacking the necessary endurance, have again seceded." And then number 9, we have New Testament evidence. There is much support in the book of Acts for a very widespread, successful Jewish mission of proselytism. They evidently came to take their calling serious, of being a light to the Gentile world. And of course the New Testament happens to be one of our best and of course our most reliable sources for Jewish proselytizing documentation. And this, remember, will be the second part of what we look at as diaspora Jewry, seed sown proselytism, and then how it relates to the New Testament church.